everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, July 10th, 2023, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download. And the way that we fund the show, both, compensating me, well, barely compensating me for my time. That's not really a part of the calculation, but being able to pay the editors, being able to pay my assistant Noelle to do all of the important work that happens behind the scenes, is that we rely on the support of listeners just like you. Historically, we also sold a lot of host-read ads, which have a much higher sell-through rate. And the ad industry is just like dead right now in podcasting. You've probably noticed it across the board. So even though I'm still doing what we call programmatic ads, so you'll notice that there are ads that are dropped within the show that were recorded professionally by the companies. My rate on those is really, really low comparatively. And yeah, we're just not able to make ends meet with that, which means that the patrons are like our biggest form of support right now. It's kind of like a PBS NPR model. I dig it. So this episode was brought to you by listeners like you. If you are interested in supporting the show, the way to do it is to visit patreon.com/talknerdy. You can see the different tiers. I try to make it worth your while, given that I'm so overloaded working, full-time as a clinician and also finishing my PhD and doing all of the podcasting. There's not a lot I can do, but we do have like ad-free episodes and different things that we try to offer you at different tiers. Also, one of the big tiers is a shout out at the top of the show. So this week's top patrons include Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, and Ulrika Hagman. And I thought maybe I would do a different kind of shout out at the top this time in terms of just the lifetime status of the patrons. The top, by far, my top 5 patrons have supported the show like multiple times over with others, and they are in order. They include Brian Holden, David J.E. Smith, Jeffrey Sewell, Daniel Lang, and Gabrielle F. Jaramillo. So the 5 of you, I cannot thank you enough because you really keep this train on the tracks. Okay, enough of that. Let's dig into this week's episode. So I had the opportunity to chat with Dr. Amber Benezra. She is an assistant professor of science and technology studies at the Stevens Institute of Technology in New Jersey. She has a really, really interesting focus of research. She's a sociocultural anthropologist who researches how studies of the human microbiome intersect with biomedical ethics, public health, or technological infrastructures and care. And she wrote a wonderful kind of trade publication, so not an overly academic book, called Gut Anthro, an experiment in thinking with microbes. So I learned a lot from this episode. I hope that you find it as fascinating as I did. Without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Amber Benezra. Well, Amber, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Me too. So your book is called Gut Anthro, an experiment in thinking with microbes. And I feel like even before we get into the content, the process requires a bit of explanation. So first and foremost, you are a sociocultural anthropologist. Help us understand the distinction, like how is anthropology sometimes sliced and diced, and specifically, what is sociocultural anthropology?
Yeah, absolutely. I think often when people think of anthropologists, they think of Indiana Jones, or maybe not so much. And maybe that cultural reference is too old for kids these days. But archaeology is one field of anthropology. So it is, as you said, sort of sliced up into 4 fields. Biological anthropologists study human evolution and primates and sort of the biological history of humans. Archaeologists study the material history of humans. Linguistic anthropology is a field that studies language. And sociocultural anthropologists study the lives of humans, sort of all of the daily practices, the ways people live, all of the things that we do that make us human, to try to make sense of it in a sociocultural way. And sort of the history of anthropology is unfortunately super colonialist and racist and horrible. And we sort of have this legacy of, white male scholars sitting on high and telling other people and what they considered, foreign cultures about themselves. And so anthropology has done a lot of work in the last, 50 years to really undo that. And so now anthropologists just study people, and are really committed to making sure the people they're studying are heard and not just representing people, in some sort of scholarly purview. And so I'm an anthropologist of science. So instead of studying, people in a faraway land, as anthropologists of old used to do, I study scientists and science and what that's doing in the world.
That's so fascinating. What made you decide to kind of narrow in on studying science and scientists? Like, where did you first start to see that interest arise?
hmm When I was in grad school, and a PhD student, that was very interesting to me. I really was sort of loath to go to a specific geographic place and become a specialist in that place, because it is sort of that old fashioned anthropology, or more conventional anthropology, I should say. And I was really interested in science and technology studies and thinking about how powerful science is, right? How it really shapes our lifestyles in so many ways. What we understand about our health, right? What we understand about the environment, what we understand about everyday living is really dictated by science in many, many ways. And it has so much power. I think it's super important to think about that interconnection with the social, and how all of those ethical implications come out of science, and how also how science is done is really determined by who's the president at the time, and what funding institution you get your money from, and what science doesn't exist in a vacuum. So those things are so intertwined, and science again is just so powerful in our lives. I think it's extremely important to think about where that knowledge is coming from and what it does in practice in people's lives.
Yeah, and I love this sort of very modern. Uh, I worry to use the word kind of postmodern because I think it has a lot of connotations, both within like the science and skeptic community, but also I think within a more, I don't know, uh, sociological or even psychological community. But like this very modern understanding that science is, yes, an endeavor and it is a process, but it's not agnostic. We wish it were, and we talk about it as if it is, yet it's done by people, and people are like deeply biased. And so, because of that, the things we choose to study, the way we choose to study them, the way that we frame them are part of the zeitgeist. And I think it's just important to have that conversation because very often we sort of skip that part when we're talking about science and we just say, okay, well, but this is scientific, which means it's fact.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, there is no such thing as objective or neutral knowledge, and that's okay. I think, like you're saying, it's okay to acknowledge that. And often I say, I teach my students to think about scientific authority and where it comes from and what it does and how it works in our lives. And that's not bad. I'm not trying to sort of eschew facts and say, nothing is true and nothing means anything at all. I'm trying to get closer to the facts so that science can be better, right? So that we can account for all of those social factors to make science the most ethical and effective it can be. And that's really what I'm dedicated to, which is a real sort of shift, in graduate school. As a social scientist, you're taught to have this critical purview on science. And when I, first started my work, the goal was to sort of look at science from the outside. But as I began to work and doing my field work and research, I realized that, wait, I can make much more of a difference and do better things in the world if I work with the science, right? If anthropology and science can work together and bring our different expertise to the table, we can make the science so much better. And so that's sort of where my professional trajectory has gone.
I love that. Is there like a name for that kind of field or that kind of multidisciplinary work? Because it's, yes, you're doing, I guess, doing quote unquote sociology, but you're doing sociology hand in hand with scientists. Like, have we started to develop what that would be called?
I think that anthropology is really reckoning with that in uncomfortable ways. I mean, science and technology studies is an interdisciplinary field, but also still has a divide between the science itself and the study of the science. And I think that just we're in a moment now where many of us in different fields, public health, geography, anthropology, sociology, are starting to think about, okay, what's the meaning of our work? And I often say, and I talk about this a lot in the book about power imbalances, science has the money and the power. Let's just be honest about that. Right. As an anthropologist, I'm never going to get a grant from the NSF that's anywhere near, what a hard scientist would get in terms of funding. And so how are we going to work together instead of keeping this sort of disciplinary divide? Because it's just not doing anything, right? It's not moving anything forward in terms of, you know, public health, social justice, any kind of, there's nothing forward moving about it. And so I've actually, I've run up against a lot of barriers because of this, because everyone loves to talk about interdisciplinarity, but there are no systems in place to support it, right? Academic jobs are in departments and you have to have a specific field that you apply to, right? Academic journals are for specific disciplines and you can't just be an interdisciplinarian and submit to things. And same for funding. So it's great to talk about collaboration, but we don't really have any systems in place to support those things. And so, as an anthropologist, I've submitted grants where other anthropologists, grant reviewers have said, this is not anthropology, like just straight up rejected it. And then many, many times my scientific collaborators just don't even know what language I'm speaking. And they're like,
Right. They
what
just
you
don't get
do
it.
makes no sense to them
Yeah.
at all. Because we're all not trained to speak the same language. That's no one's fault. It's just that, the way that our academic institutions are set up.
Yeah, they've been siloed for so long that like it's funny, I'm going to bring up a personal experience real quick just as a kind of side mention, but we were just saying offline that I'm actively finishing my PhD like right now. I'm in the last, so I'm doing clinical psychology, but I'm trained in existential or the existential orientation. So my dissertation is this like existential hermeneutic phenomenological investigation of people choosing to use medical aid in dying. So I'm interviewing people late in life who are deciding to die with medical aid and really trying to understand their lived experience of those decisions, what's been difficult, what's been easy, how do they feel about these decisions, how does their support systems feel, all that great stuff. What's it been like interfacing with the medical system? And one of the things that's been a struggle for me is that nobody in my entire university or including my committee members do this. So it's like I'm even working with mentors who are brilliant and lovely, but also like we're all figuring it out as we go. B, I'd say that 80% of the references in my dissertation are not from psychology journals. They're not written in APA. They're not even from a sort of quote psychology perspective. They're from nursing and chaplaincy and anthropology, and because that's where phenomenology has I guess been more popular. And so I see a very similar struggle where I'm like, okay, I want to do this thing as a psychologist and talk about it through a psychological lens. And there's all these brilliant other fields that have already done it. And I don't want to reinvent the wheel. But at the same time, how do I bring it into psychology more? And that's not to say anybody listening who's a psychologist is like, I do phenomenology all the time. Like, of course, there are people who do a lot of phenomenology within psychology. But it's just interesting that, like, end of life care, palliative care, all these different things, I chose a field, I think in some ways very similar to how you chose a field, where people are like, oh, that's a thing? Okay, figure it out.
Yeah. And it's very worthwhile to do that, but it's also extremely difficult. Like you're saying, like you don't necessarily have um, the support of senior faculty who they may support your work but don't have the expertise in it, right? And that's the really wonderful and also horribly frustrating thing about multidisciplinary collaboration is that everyone has different kinds of expertise for a reason. I don't expect the scientists I work with to have the background in thinking about these sociocultural issues the same way that I do, right? They're experts in metagenomics and microbiome science. And that's what they should be experts in. But also, there has to be space in the science to think about and account for these other things that I'm an expert in, right? And so, finding the right people to work with who can value what they don't know, as on a sort of equal level with what they do know, is an extremely, extremely difficult part. And that's what the book is about a lot, is that collaboration is so important and almost crucially necessary at this point in our human lives, but almost impossible to actually accomplish because it's so hard.
There's this weird paradox wherein in doing multidisciplinary work, you're actually in some ways more isolated, even though you're working with collaborators, at least maybe mentally isolated. I don't know how to describe it, versus doing independent work in your field where maybe you're not actively trying to collaborate, but just by virtue of like the people in the rooms next door doing similar work, you already have a support network in place.
Yes,
Does that make
1,000%.
sense?
So, yes.
Okay.
So, I did my field work at Washington University in St. Louis in a microbiome lab there. And while the PI of the lab was extremely invested in anthropology as he understood it and wanting to make this partnership work, all of the junior scientists in the lab had no idea what I was doing there. They thought I was going to be like hiding behind tanks, like taking secret notes about them or something. They just were like, "What are you doing here?
Like
What
a
is
Wes
your work
Anderson
doing?"
film or
Yes.
something. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And some of them like straight up were like, "I don't feel comfortable talking to you because they have a lot more at stake in terms of the fragility of their future careers and funding and labs and all that sort of thing." So I understood that, and so many times when I speak to scientific audiences, people will just ask me, "Can you just turn this into some kind of quantitative data that I can understand?" Because sure, you talk to people in this place and like, but please quantify it because I just don't even know what you're saying. And part of my work is to refuse that and say, well, actually, you need to figure out the value of qualitative work and see how this is different than the work you do and how it has real value. But also, what I really learned from my, decade of doing this work was that anthropology also has to change. So, on a lot of one part of it was expecting science to open up to these different kinds of social science perspectives. But also, I've learned that anthropology needs to be different too in order to make these collaborations work. So, you're right. It's very isolating because you don't fit into either place, really. You're really an outsider in your own field, right? My senior faculty on my dissertation committee, and all the anthropologists were like, "Oh boy," they're like, "You're in too deep now with the scientists. You're like," they literally said things like, "You drank the scientific Kool-Aid. You're like, you're off the map now." And the scientists were like, "Well, what you do isn't real science. So,
Right. It's
how
like,
can we
that's
work?"
not, you're just like telling us your feelings, right? Like that's like, no, it's still empirical.
Yes, like I did field work in Bangladesh with families that were enrolled in the microbiome study, and I talked to 9 families. I talked to them every day for 6 weeks and figured out how they felt being enrolled in the scientific study. But it was only not, my N was 9, and to scientists that's not meaningful data, right?
Yeah, this is why I work on another show called The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. And one of the pithy things, and I get it, it does have value. I get what people mean when they're saying it, but one of the pithy things that scientists and especially scientific skeptics love to say is the plural of anecdote is not data. And I'm always like, except for when it is, And I think it is really important to remember. I get what you're saying. Obviously, 3 people randomly said this thing happened. We need to look at larger ends, and we need to look at patterns, and we need to compare things against placebos and all that great stuff in order to make, real quantitative statements about how things work. But at the same time, there's certain things that you can't study traditionally. You can't do a randomized control trial on how people feel about being enrolled in a microbiome study. That's not how you
Absolutely.
that's not how you answer that question.
Yes. And we've also seen sort of over the years of, having that kind of data, population level data, it doesn't always tell us a very clear story. So we can be as like general and reductive as we want about a group of people, but there are going to be people that are left out. And that's really, sort of the heart of the anthropology is which people are left out, right? Which people are excluded from the benefits that come out of this data and why? Because it's not coincidental who it is, right? It's very race and gender and class based and things like that. So we need to do science better. And that has been not the most effective way of looking at things with huge ends. Great. You have looked at a million people's, heart rate data, but has it really led to better health interventions? Not always for everyone, right? So that's the kind of thing that
100%.
anthropology can really bring to that sort of thing. Yeah.
I love that. I love that. And so, you mentioned this microbiome study. We've been talking about your interest in interfacing or basically encapsulating, really studying science and the scientific method and scientists and their endeavors from an anthropological perspective. But we haven't talked about the microbiome. So tell me a little bit more. Has it always from the beginning, has that been a component of sort of clinical medicine, medical science that you've been fascinated by? Or was that a specific project kind of separate from some of the other interesting endeavors that you've had?
I think it's sort of all related, but when I was, looking for a dissertation project, I had a faculty member, Emily Martin at NYU, was like, you should look at the Human Microbiome Project. I think you'd be interested in it. Because I was thinking about kinships and, anthropology is all about social relationships and kinship charts and things like that. But I was thinking about how new technologies are allowing for different kinds of kinships to be made, right? Genetic technologies, right? All those sorts of ancestry testing, all that sort of stuff. And so the Human Microbiome Project was just becoming a thing in 2009 when I started this work. And I very fortunately connected with Dr. Jeff Gordon at WashU, and he was one of the PIs on the Human Microbiome Project, but also, again, thinking in these bigger philosophical and social questions about the microbiome. And for me, so, you probably know all of the like facts that get thrown around that we have more microbial cells in our bodies than human cells, a lot more microbial genes than human genes. And as an anthropologist, I'm like, well, that's really cool because if we're made up of all these different organisms, what does that mean for us as humans? And how do our social lives, all of our intimacies, who we live with, if we have dogs, who we sleep in the same bed with, right? Like what food we eat, what part of the world we live in, contribute to our microbial populations, right? What our mode of birth is, if we're born by C-section or vaginally, all of those things make up our microbes. So those things are social things and they interact with the biological in this really interesting way. So that's extremely anthropological to me. And especially as we learn more about the microbiome, and as next generation sequencing technologies get more and more advanced and we can see those microbes better, we've started to think about our health in terms of our microbes, right? What microbes we have in our guts, what are they doing, and how what they're doing affects our overall states of health and illness. So we are so connected with these other organisms that we've evolved with as long as we've been human beings on Earth. That's so awesome and fascinating to me. That I think both anthropology and science need to account for that kind of relationship in these different ways, but reckon with, okay, we can't think, like, obviously we're really trained to think of microbes as pathogens, especially during COVID and everything, right? We think of germs as bad and microbes as disease causing, but really 99% of the ones on our bodies are actually essential for our health and really keeping us alive. Dr. Gordon would always say, it's a microbial world. We just live in it. Like, they don't give a shit about us. They could live forever without us. We need them to live. We would die within a matter of days without them. So that's really cool as an anthropologist to think about. Um, and more work is starting to be done thinking about, well, what are different, you know, ways of living in terms of nutrition and the kind of food you get, and whether you live around toxic exposures or whether you live in poverty or whether you live under the stress of systemic racism that also affect the microbes you have. So that stuff's really important to me to think about. And that's how this collaboration sort of came to be, is that I started working in the Gordon lab as an anthropologist for the lab. And they were doing a lot of global health malnutrition studies looking at the gut microbes of kids in resource poor countries. And so they had a field site in Dhaka, Bangladesh, where they were getting, hundreds and hundreds of samples all the time. When you're looking at the gut microbiome, you have to look at poop. There's so much poop. You can't like look in someone's intestines to see what's going on with the microbes there. You have to look at what comes out in their poop. So they're getting all these biological samples, but really had no connection to the people there at all. So I was the first person from the lab to go to Bangladesh and just talk to those folks and see what their everyday lives were like and try to contribute that ethnographic data to the science to make the science more nuanced, richer, and make sense in a different way.
I'm curious, like prior to you joining this, research collaboration, and obviously we're talking about an entire lab, which means that there are like multiple hypotheses being run at once. There are lots of different experiments going on, which is typical. But like generally speaking, when these researchers would talk about their sort of the purpose of the research, the takeaway. Like clearly they were studying the gut microbiomes of, oftentimes these children, but like to what end? Was it just basically we want to understand more about basically what the body of somebody, what the microbiome of somebody who is in a resource poor environment looks like? Or was it like, we want to develop biomarkers? We're trying to understand, like, why? Was there a why behind it?
Absolutely. I think they're very much dedicated to solving the problem of malnutrition. I think there was a much bigger public health goal in solving the problem this way. And I mean, as we talked about before, this is where qualitative and quantitative data sort of clash with each other because malnutrition is not one thing, right? It's different
Right.
in every location. And they were looking, they had a bunch of different sites, but in Dhaka, people are not malnourished because of food scarcity. That's not the problem there. It's that there's so much diarrheal illness that you can't maintain any kind of nutrition in your gut when you have enteric disease for huge parts of the year, right? There's something they call the cholera season there, right? So when there's so much diarrheal illness, people just can't hold on to any nutrients in their guts. And so
Okay.
that's the problem. And so the Gordon
Gotcha.
Lab was looking at families in particular they started with twins, right? So one kid was malnourished, one kid was healthy, and they would look at their gut microbes and say, okay, what's the difference here? They're in the same family, presumably they have the same genes, so why is one malnourished and one not?
Right,
And
and
so
the
they
same
developed
diet. Yeah,
exactly.
interesting.
So
Okay.
they developed this theory of a malnourished microbiome. And so what did that look like, and what microbial populations were there and which were missing? And so they're really dedicated and continue to work on this problem, and are now doing clinical trials for probiotic supplements, and also microbiota directed foods, things that will support good microbes, right, or the microbes that these kids are missing, in order to have some kind of medical intervention to what they call fix a broken microbiome. So that was that they absolutely had a very clear health intervention goal, which is also supported by they're supported by the Gates Foundation, which also is very much about like what sort of translational medicine can we put into action to solve this problem. I'm in the background sort of being like, okay, that's cool, totally do that, but people in Dhaka also have no clean water. Water in Dhaka is extremely, polluted with industrial effluent, arsenic, heavy metals, sewage. Also, there's no good governmental system of sanitation or, sewage. So that's people have open drains in front of their houses. There are all kinds of other social problems. Bangladesh has only been a free nation since 1971. There's a terrible history of colonialism for hundreds of years. And, there's also all kinds of gender, religious, and ethnic inequities. Those things are also contributing to people's lives. And you can't just give them a probiotic to solve those problems, right? And this has sort of been the failing of scientific health interventions globally and development in general, is that we're like, okay, we figured out this really cool scientific solution to this problem. Let's pretend all this other structural stuff doesn't exist because it's way too hard to deal with. But that stuff has to be accounted for. And again, like, I'm not blaming the scientists. They're not experts in this stuff. It's not their job necessarily to fix the infrastructure of DACA. But when you're looking at your scientific data, you have to account for that stuff. You can't pretend it doesn't exist, right? Because your interventions are going to fail because people's lives are still going to be the same.
Obviously, like, I love how you're conceptualizing this, because it really does kind of paint a beautiful picture of the context of these people's lives. And I know that I'm probably oversimplifying here, but it's this tale, this age-old tale of like, well, how do I treat the problem instead of trying to figure out how to prevent it from happening in the first place? And that's not to say that, like you said, these systemic issues can't be solved, at least not overnight. But there are protective mechanisms, buffers that can be put in place. But the only way to do that is to really, really understand them, and to not kind of come at it from this very like Western lens and say, well, this is what we would do. It's like, okay, you're not there, like, you don't know how, if that wouldn't work. And so, yeah, it's sort of, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. But like, really, there are so many things in this world that we try to cure without understanding why they're happening to begin with.
Yes, totally. And I think that it's such a hard thing because, again, in the sciences, you're not trained to think about that stuff, right? You may work on one protein your entire scientific career and not look outside at the context of it because it's so much and it's so overwhelming. But it actually will make the science better if you are able to look at it. And, an example I always give is that when I was in Dhaka, there was a huge water boiling campaign. There was the public health had all of these messages about you have to boil your water. It's unsafe to drink otherwise. And so all the families I knew in this neighborhood and the whole community knew about this water boiling mandate. Yet when I was in the houses with them, no one boiled their water. And what I found out was that, there are 5 families sharing a 2-burner gas stove. So they take turns on the stove. The gas service is super unreliable. So they might have gas service only from 9 to 10 in the morning, and then it's off for the rest of the day. So mothers in particular would have to make a decision. Okay, am I going to cook food for my family so that my family has food to eat all day? Or am I going to spend like an hour boiling a huge pot of water? And they're like, no, that's stupid. I'm not going to do that. Right. I need my family to eat. So they had to make these practical prioritizations. They had the knowledge about water boiling, but then, the hospital's like, why is the water boiling thing not working? We told them, they know they're supposed to do this. But this is where ethnography is really valuable, because you can be like, well, they can't. This is what happens on the ground.
And I think we see this a lot, even, right in our own backyard when we look at social interventions for public health emergencies. We saw it during COVID, clearly, but we see it when it comes to like, unhoused individuals or individuals who are struggling with mental illness. And it's like, well, I don't understand. I'm telling the resources are right there. Why aren't they using them? And it's like, not until you get into it and you go, yeah, but there's like all these stipulations and all these caveats, and it's like only open from this time to this time, and we're criminalizing and punishing them if they like miss one appointment. It's like all these little things that we don't take the time to understand the actual everyday effects of them. On paper, they look great.
Right, right. Absolutely. And that's what's really tough. And I think that something that I ask my scientific collaborators to do, which is also really difficult, is think about science's complicity in the creation of these problems. So why are people in Bangladesh malnourished? It has everything to do with this history of colonialism and politics and economy. And science didn't just arrive on the scene innocently having no part of this history. And that's very, very difficult to face when you're a scientist, and hard to come to terms with, because you want to just look at the microbes and fix that problem on a biological level. And so, this is why collaboration is very difficult. But on the other hand, I often am like, I could be an anthropologist that just writes books for other anthropologists. So what? Who cares about that? Right? What has anthropology ever done to actually try to solve these practical health problems? Not a lot, right? So I look to the science in order to like practical action, like things that are actually making a difference.
Yeah, and obviously when you are in a position where there is a team with boots on the ground and there's a carved out role for collaboration, for contributing these perspectives to their literature, that's that's a clear benefit. But I think there's this sort of secondary benefit that comes out where even though you may be having these conversations with these scientists and they're like, yeah, whatever, I don't get it. Or even though you're like, no, but think about this. And they're like, but I can't, I got to focus on this. There's still this like intersubjective thing that's happening where the next time they endeavor to answer questions about the world, even though you're not there, like they're thinking about it in a slightly different way. And even if it's a 5% change in the mentality and the perspective that's like more social justice oriented, more inclusive, or even just more anthropological in nature, like that is a systemic over time change to the way we do science. And that's why it's so important that we collaborate, because those collaborative effects like ring on in the future.
Mm-hmm. I really hope so. I mean, that's sort of my life's goal in many ways. And, just even asking the scientific team, like, why these bodies? Why are these the people who are the study subjects? What are the sort of problems with that when we talk about the Bangladeshi microbiome and the Western microbiome, right? What are we actually saying when we categorize people like that? And that's why a lot of my more recent work is dealing with race in the microbiome, because, as you know, in science, everyone agrees race is a social construct. But in many ways, scientists use that as an excuse to be like, well, that's not my purview. I don't deal with the social, so I'm not going to touch race. That's not my thing. But then in the next breath, we'll be like, in my study, this happened to Black subjects and this happened to white subjects. Right?
Yeah.
So,
Who knows
so
why? We can never
yes,
know.
yes. And sort of rebiologizing race as a real thing, with, quote unquote, without accounting for the social. So I think exactly what you're saying, really taking to task microbiome science. I had a co-authored paper about an anti-racist future for microbiome science, to be like, hey, if when you're using the ideas of race in your work as a scientist, you have to think about why. What do you mean by race? How can you can't talk about race without talking about racism. And that's going to be a necessary part of this. And so I've actually been really excited by junior scientists and a lot of new people who are coming up in microbiome science who actually are centering social justice and things like anti-racism in their work as crucial to the science. And that's super exciting and something that I did not really expect to happen. And I think there may be a sea change on the horizon in terms of how junior scientists think about the science itself. And as this other stuff is core to how they practice their science, design their experiments, write their papers. And hopefully there's a change on the way.
Yeah. It's interesting because we've been talking quite a bit about, I often make the distinction, I don't know, it's a psychotherapeutic distinction, but I think it kind of makes sense in other contexts. But I often talk about the difference between sort of process and content, right? The process is the how we do it, and the content is the like what is being done or what is kind of the outcome of that. And so like when I think about therapy, I learned this very early on when I was doing therapy, where I would focus a lot on content with my supervisor. So I'd be like, oh, I sat with my client and they said this and this and this. And then they're like, yeah, but what's the process? Like what's happening? Not just like what are the things they're listing in therapy, but like what is this reflecting? What greater patterns are you seeing? All that good stuff. So I'm thinking about the process and the content of your work. And I know that in asking this question, it's almost like an eye roll of a question. But for the listeners, I'm curious, when it comes to your quote unquote findings, which is a way that I like to write about it. I don't like to say results because it's not like a classic, you're not doing classical experimentation, but like when it comes to the findings, the takeaways, the big picture kinds of things that you learned, especially, for example, in Bangladesh, were you able to have some sort of commentary about why twin 1 versus twin 2 was, not absorbing nutrition, or their, idiosyncrasies, or, was there something about their personhood, their experiences that was deeply contributing to these sort of medical outcomes?
Hmm. I think what I would say, and maybe this is like very anthropologist of me, but I think that part of it was talking to those people who were subjects and finding out from them how they felt about being enrolled, what they were getting out of it. I think a hugely problematic thing about scientific research, especially by American research institutions in other countries, is asking communities what their health priorities are and what they care about. And those things may not jibe with what the science wants to learn, but maybe too bad. Maybe that's where we need to be, because, what I did learn was that none of the mothers enrolled in the study knew what good microbes are, or the microbiome. They were only taught about disease causing organisms and hygiene, which is completely opposite of what the scientists were studying. But somewhere along the path of the network, someone decided, well, this is too confusing and it doesn't matter to these women to actually understand what we are doing. They're getting free medical care for their kids, and this is what how we're going to explain it to them, which I'm not sure if that's right or wrong, but there was a disconnect between what the science was doing, what the mothers understood they were contributing. And we have to resolve some kind of benefit sharing for the people who are giving their biological material, their time, right? Their actual lives is the scientific data. And what are they actually getting out of it? Because they don't give a shit about contributing to scientific knowledge, nor should they, right? What difference does it make to them? So what do they get out of it in terms of their long-term health? Where I grapple with this is like, I'm not at all trying to say science is bad, social science is good, right? Like that's not where I'm at in any way, because of all the kids who were enrolled in the Microbiome Discovery Project, they all lived, which isn't necessarily the norm for that community. And I want to be on the side of that, right? That's important to me. So again, that study did a lot more to actually improve people's lives than anthropology has ever done in the history of time. But on the other hand, it doesn't mean there weren't problems with it. And there has to be room to think about both things simultaneously. But I think something that's extremely important is to be working with communities, especially these vulnerable populations that are always sampled in every new wave of science, like we have genetic testing, all the things. We just go back to the same populations to sample. And it's time to ask them what they actually care about. What are they going to get out of the scientific results, and the knowledge that's created, and any benefit that comes out of it? That's extremely important, because they may care about something completely different, and that might have to be what we focus on.
Yeah, and in essence, in the grand scheme of things, that might offer, in what we would see, again, it's so hard to even talk about this because it's so deeply like biased and contextualized, but like what, let's say, a, kind of colonial scientist, or let's just say a Western scientist who's coming into a community and is like, this is a public health crisis that's been identified by the WHO, by the CDC, and that's why we want to study it. We have plenty of legitimate scientific research to back up why this matters. And they come in and they say, this, let's do this thing. And then the people who are living there are like, yeah, but let me tell you about this other thing that the WHO never bothered to record. Let me tell you about this other thing that is so much more important to our everyday lives because it's completely fucking our quality of life, but we don't write it down because it's not a 1 to 2% increase in infant mortality or whatever. And I don't know, I keep going back in my head, probably because it's so salient to me right now, to the study that I've been doing with these individuals who are dying with medical aid, and this big conversation that we see about quality versus quantity of life. And that so often in the medical establishment, it's like, no, but how can I keep you alive for as long as possible? It's always, what is the prognosis? What is the survivorship? One of my study participants has glioblastoma multiforme, and he's lived longer than what he was prognosticated to live. But I don't know if he wants to live much longer like this. And that's the question, right? Like, we can say, anyone can say, from my biased perspective, this is what you should want, And then the person's like, you don't know me. You don't know what it feels like to have that thing that you're talking about. And I'd like to completely change the question, which can be very confronting to scientists who have dedicated time and money to something.
Yes, I think that's such a good point, that to think about that prolonging life is not a universal goal. That is
Right.
just a shift in perspective that we need to have, to be like, oh, wait, that's a specifically Western medical perspective. It's not true for all humans, because that's the assumption. And that's kind of the problem with science, is that it makes this universal generalization as if all biology is the same, all, feelings and philosophies are the same. And when you start from that place, you can't really get anywhere good. And it's absolutely the same when I first went to DACA and I asked people, what do you eat that's nutritious food? They were like, what the hell is nutritious food? They're like, if we have food, it's good for us. I didn't even think about the fact that idea of nutrition is very specifically relative to, again, Western medicine. What we
Right,
think of
to a
as
place where we have
nutritious food.
abundance. Yeah, like,
Mhm.
we can choose anything. Are we choosing the empty, quote unquote, calories? Are we choosing the things that are high in, like, micro and macronutrients? Like, they're like, what are you talking about? I'm eating food.
Yes. We
Oh,
think of like fat and
fascinating.
sugar as bad, right? And they're like, but we have food to eat. That's great for us. That's going to keep us alive and healthy. So I was like, oh shit, I need to reorient even the questions I ask, because I'm coming from a place of bias that I didn't think about. And it kind of goes back to the very beginning of our conversation here. It's okay to admit you have bias, because, as you said, we're human beings and that's how we are made. But we can't start asking questions as if we aren't biased.
Sorry to cut you off. I grappled with this when I was setting out to do this project, because I'd never done phenomenology before. And so, there's this like debate in phenomenology between more like Husserlian and Heideggerian phenomenology. You know all of this, but I'm saying it for the benefit of the people listening. But like with Husserl, who talks about bracketing and epiche, and this idea that like, I'm going to take all of my biases and I'm going to put them on the shelf when I do this investigation. And because my biases are on the shelf, I'm going to get as close to the truth as possible. And his student, Heidegger, who I have a very complex relationship with Heidegger, because he was a fucking Nazi, but he was also brilliant. And, there's a lot of, complicated stuff there. But he was like, that is dumb. Like, you cannot do that. You have biases. You cannot bracket them. Like, the best way to get close to truth is to make them explicit. And so that's the choice that I made. And I did a hermeneutic, a Heideggerian approach to my research, which was basically like, these are the things from the outset that I believe. And hopefully that they're iterated throughout this process and they change and they grow. But like, I'm not going to sit here and say I don't have preconceptions about this. I have my own biases. I went into this study as a proponent of medical aid in dying, thinking that everybody should have the choice to do it if if they qualify, whatever. I still believe that, but my views have evolved throughout this study. And I think that's the important thing that all science could learn from, is this idea that like, we should be making all of our biases explicit at the very top of all of our research, but we don't do that as common practice.
Yeah. And I absolutely agree with you that that will make things better and make better options and truth, whatever that means, more available to us. Because every word you choose when you're writing an article has to do with your bias and your context and your situatedness, in all of the forms of knowledge that you have. where you got your funding from, what university you're at, all of those things, have a context to them that matter. And so, yes, if we put them out there and then we're like, okay, where are we going to go from here? Instead of starting in some occluded way, pretending that we're, somehow neutral. I mean, we're seeing this so much in like things like AI, right? That we're just like, oh, AI is neutral, AI is objective. Well, no, absolutely not. It's coded by biased human beings. I think the same as AI, when we look at microbiome science, there's a lot of work being done on indigenous microbiome, whatever that means, right? Or looking at a paper just came out last week that talks about the hunter gatherer microbiome, that thinks about people who still live off, land-based subsistence farming, or thinking about plant-based diets as our ancestral microbiome, which is hugely problematic because those people live in 2023 and are affected by all the same kinds of climate, toxic exposures, things that everyone is. But we're, studying again these specific populations in service of fixing a Western microbiome that maybe is broken because of, overuse of antibiotics and C-sections and all kinds of things. And so we can't see those things, even those questions as neutral. I think, as maybe you said before, even the questions we ask in our research come from a specifically situated place, right? Even if we don't want to use the word bias, they're different places we're situated in. And so, we have to think about those things.
It's interesting, like the parallel that comes to my mind, which is probably not even appropriate, but whatever, I thought of it, so I'm going to say it out loud, is the way that we do ancestral DNA research. Like, you think about these companies like 23andMe, and literally, I think what a lot of people don't understand is when we look at the science of how they come to the conclusions they come to about what percent this you are and what percent that you are is based on extant populations of people. So like, and that's why there's like all this information about like, oh, you're pretty Irish, but you're only a little Scottish. It's like, F you. Those things are like next door to each other. There's no way that we know that. Yet then it's like, oh, you're just generally African. It's like, because there's no data there. But ultimately, to say you're more West African or you're more Southern African is insanity, because that just assumes that there was no migration out and back in. It's basically, yeah, like you are the most related to the people who live there now. But that's a massive assumption that is not caveated when people talk about this stuff.
Yes. Oh boy, don't even get me started on genetic ancestry testing. Like whenever I bring this up with my students, they're like, "Oh boy, here she goes." But like, it's first of all, the science. There is no science. It's bullshit. It's bullshit
Right.
wrapped in a scientific package. And
Uh-huh.
it's recreational genomics, which, as you're saying, they're comparing your genome to someone who they decided was going to be the representation of the Japanese genome, and then
Mhm.
comparing how alike your genome is to theirs. It's complete nonsense. The
Mhm.
fact that there would even be such a thing as Irish DNA, Ireland is a nation. It's
I
a
know,
government.
right?
It's not a
Yeah.
place where biological material is made, right? Kim Tallbear has an amazing book called Native American DNA, because as if that would even be a thing, right?
Right.
And Native Americans in this country were hundreds of millions of different people in different tribes of different ethnicities. And now we
Mhm.
boil it down to one thing in terms of like 23andMe. There's one kind of, Native American DNA.
Oh,
That's not a
God.
thing. It doesn't
Right.
exist. And, I
Right.
often say, like, there is some value. People who are African Americans who are descended from enslaved people can find some value in trying to trace their land of origin, but for white
Mhm.
people, it's just to become more interesting. To be like, I'm not just white.
Mhm.
I'm like this much Scottish and this much, whatever, South African. It's complete
Yeah.
nonsense. It makes me feel like my head's going to explode.
I love it. Oh, I'm so glad we actually got to touch on that. Well, gosh, I
Yeah.
feel like there's so much more to talk about, but of course my file, nobody knows this, or maybe they do because I don't know how good the editing is. I'm trying to see the future, but the file keeps like shitting the bed, and I want to keep you and not have that happen one more time. two things. I always close my show by asking my guests the same two big picture questions. I'm going to be fascinated by your answers just because I'm fascinated by you and your work. But before we do that, obviously there is stuff, but is there anything very that you would be remiss that we haven't talked about? You know what I mean? Is there anything that you want to make sure the listener knows if they're interested in reading about your work and buying the book that we didn't cover?
I think so. I think the title kind of says it all. The book is a lot about this collaboration, even more than the science of the microbiome, but about trying to do this interdisciplinary work. And also, spoiler alert, this partnership's ultimate failure, how it didn't work in the end. But also, it's like deeply personal to me and my life and what happened when we do this kind of work. And in this way, it's a very sort of feminist anthropology book and talking about, what happened with my family along the way and what happened to my having kids while I was trying to finish my dissertation, and like how you do field work now as a professor when you have a family, and all of the sort of really complicated things that we're supposed to leave out of the story, especially as women scholars. I'm just because that's my identification. So we're supposed to not talk about those things as part of our career path because it sentimentalizes us and makes us somehow less credible. But it turns out it's extremely important to the work we do. And so I want to sort of forefront it. And also bring anthropology to task for leaving that out for so long. And so that's kind of an important thing to be said, I think. Yeah.
Absolutely. And such a not just important, but like in a lot of ways, like a brave thing to do to make those things explicit, knowing the sort of patriarchal structures that we're in and knowing that there will always be backlash to being so explicit about those things. I'm glad. I know we didn't get into it too deeply, but I'm glad that even kind of a little bit that this forum allowed for that, which is what I try to do with the show. So Amber, maybe on that note, maybe on a completely different note, I'm really curious about your answers to my closing two questions, and they're really big picture questions. But you're a big picture thinker, so I don't think I'm going to be gotchaing you. When you think about the future, in whatever context feels relevant to you, so this could be vocational, it could be familial, it could be communal, global, cosmic, whatever. First, I'm curious, what is the thing that is keeping you up the most at night, the thing that is most disconcerting, worrisome, maybe you're feeling pessimistic, maybe even cynical about? And then on the flip side of that, to really tap into sort of an authentic, not saccharine, not Pollyanna view, where are you finding your hope lately? Where are you finding your optimism? Like, what are you looking forward to?
Hmm. I mean, I think that uh, I, phew, those are really good questions. I'm like,
They're
how do
mean, I
I?
know.
No, they're good and they're great to think about. I had a lot of personal tragedy in the year 2018. And I think that came on the not tail, in the middle of, a Trump administration. And then at the, toward the beginning of COVID. And we've just been in this chaotic state in this country for, I feel like 6 years at least, right? 6 or 7 years. And just a constant state of fearfulness. I'm raising two daughters and that scares the fucking shit out of me. And I think about, reproductive justice in this country and just raising women in this, horribly misogynistic world. And so those things, like, I feel like I've been in a constant state of sort of fear and worry for a very long time. And I think that the flip side of that, and it is really tied to my work, what I've been trying to sort of suss out of the microbiome science, I sort of said at the very beginning, is this idea of connectivity. So our interconnection with these organisms. And in the end of my book, I start to explore all of these sort of elided indigenous cosmologies and how indigenous scholars and theorists for a long time have been talking about relationality, with land, with animals, with other organisms. And, we have a climate crisis. We have a political divisiveness crisis. And all of that has to do with, not to sound too like Buddhist right now, but like with disconnection, right? From, Earth, other organisms, other humans. So I see the microbiome stuff as having this potentiality to think about reconnections. I'm thinking more environmentally about my work a lot because for microbes, we are an ecosystem, right? Our bodies are, but there are so many microbes in soil, land, water, like you know, all of the environments on Earth also have particular microbes. So there's a sort of flow of connectivity between us and Earth and like other humans. And I think that if we don't get serious about thinking about those relations with all these other things, we're going to really be fucked. But I think there's also the potential for us to start thinking in that way. And that's really the answer. And like really trying to find hopefulness in this idea that, well, what you can do is be kind and think about, your connection to others and the earth and other organisms. And, I am typically a like skeptic and cynical person. And so these words sound weird coming out of my mouth, um, but I think that's like, if I don't want to, jump off a bridge, those are the things I have to hold on to.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that, it's always so fascinating to me how many people answer this question as a sort of two sides of the same coin answer, right? Like the thing that they're most concerned about is also the thing in different aspects or in different contextualization that they are the most hopeful about. But it's also amazing to me how often we can whittle down that hope to like empathy and compassion and just like decentering yourself, like, oh, just, think about others and how they're impacted. Just think about like the effects of our behavior on the planet. And it's so sad how often we just don't do that, and how that what we think of as a minor perspective shift has these monumental consequences. Mm. Ugh, it's been such a joy chatting with you. I want to thank you for like being so flexible with our reschedules, and actually we're like talking on a problematic holiday to say the least, but definitely on a holiday, when, obviously like work is closed and it's early in the day. So you will go now and be with your family, but I do really appreciate you taking the time with us, and just, enlightening us to these really important topics to grapple with. So everybody, the book is Gut Anthro, an experiment in thinking with microbes by Dr. Amber Benezra. Did I say that right? Benezra? Yay. Gosh, thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a joy talking to you.
Ah, and everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.